Hong Kong in the early 70s was a city caught between two worlds, a place where the remnants of British colonial authority scraped against the raw, burgeoning energy of the local population. In the Wanchai district, the air was never truly still. It was a heavy, saline mist that carried the scent of the harbor, diesel exhaust, and the roasting meats from 1,000 street stalls. By night, the district transformed into a labyrinth of neon-lit bars and crowded social clubs, places where sailors, merchant marines, and expatriates came to burn off their wages and their frustrations. The Blue Anchor was one such place, a narrow establishment tucked away on a side street where the humidity seemed to double once you stepped through the door. It was a space defined by the sound of industrial fans struggling against the heat, the rhythmic clinking of glass, and the low, constant murmur of men who had spent too many months at sea. On this particular July evening, the bar was nearly full. The floor was slightly tacky from spilled beer and the tracked in moisture of the summer rains, and the smoke from cheap cigarettes hung in stagnant layers just below the ceiling. In a small booth near the back, away from the direct path of the entrance, sat Bruce Lee. At this point in his life, he was a man in his early 30s, possessing a physical frame that was lean and functional, stripped of any unnecessary mass. He was dressed in a simple, dark short-sleeved shirt, and he sat with a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. He wasn't there to draw attention to himself, he was waiting for a colleague to discuss a film project, but the colleague was late. Bruce watched the room with a focused, quiet observation, his eyes moving with a steady, unhurried rhythm that noted the exits, the movement of the staff, and the rising volume of the men at the center tables. Among those men was a British merchant marine known as Miller. He was a man built of dense muscle and thickened bone, standing nearly 6 feet 4 inches and weighing well over 200 pounds. His hands, resting on the scarred wooden table, were large and mapped with the calluses of heavy labor and years of amateur boxing. Miller was in the middle of a loud, boisterous story, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of the bar. He had been drinking for several hours, and his movements had taken on that heavy, deliberate quality of a man who felt entirely untouchable in his environment. Miller's gaze eventually drifted toward the back of the bar, settling on the man sitting alone with a cup of tea. To Miller, Bruce looked like just another local, perhaps a bit more fit than average, but small, quiet, and seemingly out of place in a room full of real men. The contrast between Bruce's stillness and the chaotic energy of the bar seemed to irritate Miller. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floorboards, and began to make his way toward the booth. His friends watched with a mixture of amusement and anticipation, sensing a confrontation that would provide the night's entertainment. Miller stopped a few feet from Bruce's table, looming over him. He smelled of sweat and gin, his breathing heavy and slightly labored from the heat. He didn't start with a punch, he started with a challenge, his voice thick with a mocking tone. He began to belittle the concept of Eastern martial arts, calling it a performance for tourists, a series of useless dances that would never hold up in a real fight. Bruce remained seated, his hands resting flat on the table. He didn't look up immediately, which Miller took as a sign of submission. "You're the one from the papers, aren't you?" Miller said, leaning down so his face was level with Bruce's. "The little man who thinks he can fight. I've seen your kind in every port. You're all talk until someone puts a real hand on you." Bruce finally looked up. His expression was neutral, showing neither fear nor anger. He told Miller quietly that he was just there for a meeting and suggested that Miller return to his friends before the situation became unnecessary. But the calm in Bruce's voice only seemed to fuel Miller's aggression. The shift from a loud bar argument to something much more dangerous happened when Miller stepped into Bruce's personal space, his shadow covering the table. He began to speak about family, specifically targeting Bruce's mother with a series of crude, pointed insults that were common among the sailors of the district, words meant to humiliate and degrade a man's heritage. In the context of Hong Kong culture, and for Bruce personally, this was the absolute boundary. The room went quiet. Even the men at the bar turned their heads, sensing the change in the air. Bruce didn't explode into movement. Instead, he stood up slowly, his chair making no sound as he moved it back. He was significantly shorter than Miller, and the physical discrepancy made the scene look like a mismatch to anyone watching. But those who looked closely could see that Bruce's weight was perfectly distributed, his feet positioned in a way that suggested he was already calculating the distance. "If you have something to say," Bruce said, his voice dropping to a low, steady pitch, "we can finish this outside. This is a place of business." Miller laughed, a short, sharp sound, and nodded toward his friends. He thought he was walking toward an easy victory, a chance to show off his strength in front of an audience. He turned and walked toward the back exit, leading the way into the narrow alleyway that ran behind the building. The crowd followed, spilling out into the damp night air, forming a loose, jagged circle in the dim yellow light of a single street lamp. The alley was slick with a mixture of rain and oil, and the ground was uneven, paved with old stones that had been smoothed by decades of traffic. It was not an ideal place for a fight, but for Bruce, the environment was part of the equation. He stepped into the center of the circle, his movements fluid and economical. He didn't take a theatrical stance, he stood with his lead foot slightly forward, his knees slightly bent, and his hands held low and relaxed. He was breathing through his nose, a deep, rhythmic cycle that kept his heart rate steady. Miller, on the other hand, took a classic heavyweight boxing posture. He tucked his chin behind his lead shoulder and raised his fists, his feet bouncing slightly in a way that was meant to generate momentum. He was heavy on his feet, and on the slick stones, this was his first mistake. He was relying on power and weight, but he lacked the traction to move it efficiently. Miller moved first. He launched a heavy left jab followed by a powerful right cross, a standard combination designed to pin an opponent down. To the onlookers, the punches looked fast and lethal. But Bruce didn't move away from the punches, he moved into them, but at an angle. This was the core of his physical strategy. By stepping slightly to the left, he allowed Miller's right cross to pass harmlessly over his shoulder. At the same time, Bruce's lead hand moved in a straight line toward Miller's face. It wasn't a swing. It was a sudden, explosive extension of the arm, powered by the rotation of the hips and the bracing of the back leg against the ground. The back fist caught Miller squarely on the bridge of the nose. The sound was a dull, wet thud, followed immediately by the spray of blood against the yellow light. Miller's head snapped back, his balance momentarily shattered. He hadn't expected to be hit so soon, and he certainly hadn't expected the force behind a man so much smaller than himself. Miller growled, the pain turning his arrogance into a desperate, focused rage. He ignored the blood running down his lip and charged forward, swinging a wide hook that carried his entire body weight. This was the moment where a traditional fighter might have backed up or tried to block, but Bruce utilized the principle of the stop hit. As Miller's shoulder turned to commit to the hook, Bruce's lead leg snapped upward. It wasn't a high, acrobatic kick, it was a low, driving side kick directed at the lead knee of the larger man. The timing was precise. Bruce's foot met Miller's knee just as Miller put his full weight onto it to power his punch. The physics of the collision were devastating. Miller's momentum carried him forward while his leg was forced backward and inward. There was a sickening, audible pop as the ligaments in Miller's knee were pushed beyond their limit. The hook Miller had thrown lost all its power, his arm swinging harmlessly through the air as his support structure collapsed. Miller hit the ground hard, his shoulder slamming into the damp stones. He tried to roll and get back to his feet, but his lead leg refused to hold him. He was gasping now, the realization of his situation beginning to override his adrenaline. He looked up and saw Bruce standing just a few feet away, completely unchanged, his breathing still steady, his posture still relaxed. The crowd was silent. There was no cheering, only a sense of profound shock at how quickly the hierarchy of the room had been inverted. One of Miller's friends started to step forward, perhaps to intervene, but he stopped after a single step. There was something in the way Bruce was standing, an absolute readiness, that made it clear that any further interference would be met with the same clinical efficiency. Bruce walked toward the grounded Miller. He didn't look like a man enjoying a victory, he looked like a man who had just finished a difficult, necessary task. He stopped just outside of Miller's reaching distance. Miller was clutching his knee, his face pale, his breath coming in ragged hitches. "The next time you want to speak about someone's mother," Bruce said, his voice flat and devoid of theatricality, "remember that your size does not protect your honor. It only makes you a larger target." Bruce didn't wait for a response. He didn't deliver a finishing blow, even though Miller was completely exposed. He simply turned his back, a gesture of complete confidence that the fight was over, and walked back through the alley entrance. He didn't run, and he didn't boast. He walked back into the bar, retrieved his jacket from the booth, and exited through the front door into the neon-lit streets of Wanchai. Back in the alley, the scene was one of grim reality. Miller had to be carried out by 3 of his friends. His nose was broken in 2 places, and his knee required surgery that would keep him off the ships for the better part of a year. The "tough guy" of the Blue Anchor had been dismantled in less than 60 seconds. In the days that followed, the story began to circulate through the bars and gymnasiums of Hong Kong. It didn't spread as a movie-like tale of a hero, but as a cautionary account among those who understood violence. People talked about the speed, yes, but mostly they talked about the economy of the movement. There were no wasted gestures. There was no fighting in the traditional sense, there was only a series of high-speed corrections to Miller's mistakes. The observers noted how Bruce had used the slickness of the alley against the heavier man, how he had waited for the exact moment of commitment before striking, and how he had remained emotionally detached throughout the entire ordeal. For the locals, it was a moment of quiet pride, a demonstration that their culture possessed a depth and a practical power that the colonial outsiders often overlooked. Over the years, the details of the Blue Anchor fight would be debated and occasionally exaggerated. Some would say Bruce knocked out 5 men, others would claim he didn't even use his hands. But the core of the story remained grounded in that single, humid night in 1971. It was a story about the reality of physical confrontation, the importance of balance, and the consequences of underestimating a man based on his appearance. Bruce Lee would go on to become a global icon, a figure whose image was synonymous with superhuman ability. But those who were there that night, or those who heard the story from the men who were, remembered him differently. They remembered him not as a dragon, but as a man who understood the mechanics of the world. They remembered the way the light hit the wet stones, the sound of the rain, and the absolute, terrifying efficiency of a person who had mastered the art of being still in the middle of a storm. The fight wasn't a turning point in history, but it was a snapshot of a man who lived his philosophy every day. It was proof that his training wasn't just for the cameras or the students in his backyard, it was a functional, living discipline. The Blue Anchor bar eventually changed owners, and the neon signs were replaced by newer, brighter ones, but for a long time, the sailors in Wanchai spoke of the night a heavyweight boxer learned that strength has very little to do with size, and that some men carry a weight within them that no amount of muscle can move. The story ended where it began, in the quiet, humid streets of a city that was always moving, always changing. Bruce Lee walked away into the crowd, becoming just another silhouette under the neon lights, leaving behind a broken man and a legend that would eventually outgrow the narrow alleyways of Hong Kong. There was no final explanation, no speech given to the crowd. The events spoke for themselves. In the end, the most dangerous man in the room wasn't the one who was looking for a fight, but the one who was prepared to end it before it even truly began. The adrenaline did not leave his system all at once, it receded like a slow, cold tide, leaving behind a sharp, heightened clarity. Bruce walked 3 blocks away from the Blue Anchor, his footsteps rhythmic and light on wet pavement. The rain had intensified, turning the neon signs of Wanchai into blurred streaks of crimson and emerald against the asphalt. He stopped at a small Dai Pai Dong, an open-air food stall, under a corrugated tin roof that hammered with the sound of the downpour. He sat on a low wooden stool and ordered a bowl of beef brisket noodles. As he waited, he looked down at his right hand. The knuckles were slightly flushed, a dull ache beginning to throb in the metacarpals. Even with perfect form, hitting a human skull was like striking a bag of wet gravel, the impact resonated up the radius and ulna, a reminder of the raw physics of violence. He slowly opened and closed his fist, testing the tendons. Everything was intact. His breathing had finally returned to its resting state, deep and abdominal, despite the humidity that made the air feel thick enough to chew. A few minutes later, a car pulled up to the curb. Out stepped a man in a damp suit, the producer Bruce had been waiting for. The man looked frazzled, checking his watch as he hurried under the tin roof. He sat down across from Bruce, apologizing profusely for the delay, citing a minor accident that had blocked the main road. "It's fine," Bruce said quietly, his voice blending with the sizzle of a nearby wok. The time wasn't wasted. The producer looked at him closely, noticing a small smear of someone else's blood on Bruce's cuff and the faint, controlled tension still radiating from his shoulders. He didn't ask what had happened. In Hong Kong in 1971, you didn't ask questions when a man looked like he had just walked out of a storm. They spoke for an hour about scripts and camera angles, but Bruce's mind kept drifting back to the alleyway. He wasn't thinking about the victory, he was analyzing the moment Miller's knee had given way. He was thinking about the waste of it, the wasted energy, the wasted anger, and the fragility of a man who relied only on his size. Meanwhile, back at the Blue Anchor, the atmosphere had shifted into something frantic. The execution they had expected to witness had turned into a ghost story. The sailors who had watched the fight were struggling to describe it to those who hadn't been outside. One man claimed Bruce had moved so fast he seemed to disappear, another insisted he hadn't even touched Miller, that the big man had simply collapsed under the weight of his own fear. The reality was far more grounded, but reality is rarely enough for a crowd. By the time the ambulance arrived for Miller, the dragon had already begun to transcend the man. The witnesses spoke of the one-inch punch as if it were a supernatural feat rather than a masterclass in kinetic linking and body alignment. They didn't see the years of broken knuckles and thousand-hour repetitions, they only saw the result. As Bruce finished his noodles and rose to leave, he felt the weight of the city pressing in. He realized that after tonight, the quiet life he enjoyed in the backstreets of Hong Kong was effectively over. He had defended his honor, but in doing so, he had fed the myth. As he stepped back out into the rain, he knew that from now on, every room he entered would fall silent, and every big Miller in the world would be looking for him, trying to find the crack in the stone. He didn't smile. He simply adjusted his collar, turned the corner, and disappeared into the gray veil of the Hong Kong night, leaving the echoes of the Blue Anchor far behind.